Dr. Heidi.
Dr. Bohaker, she was also one of the key expert witnesses in our litigation. Miigwech.
Bonjour, Heidi Nitishnakas, Toronto Nitonchi, and I was sitting here listening to Alan and Deb this morning and thinking, please keep talking. I just want to keep listening to the amazing things you have to say. This is such a great opportunity. Miigwech, I have to say, for the honor of being here today at the 2022 Robertson Huron Treaty Gathering. I realize I am the Shaganashkwe standing between you and lunch. I'm keenly aware of that. So I will keep that keenly in mind. I do have to say, though, how grateful I am to be here on this land. I was born on Mississauga territory in Williams Treaty Territory, and my family and I today live in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And for more than 20 years, which seems an awfully long time, and I knew Alan back then too, so we've just gotten. We're 29 still, surely. But I've been studying Indigenous Crown relations and Anishinaabe history as part of my work to better understand and tell truths about Canadian history. And like many of you in this room, my generation and older, went to school and learned nothing about Indigenous history, or the barest or crudest of stereotypes. And nothing about the rich history of the land, nothing about treaties. And I look at my 12-year-old son, who's now in a Toronto middle school, and he does land acknowledgements every day. And he's learning about Indigenous histories. And elders come into the school. Our school actually has a sizable urban Indigenous population. And he came home yesterday, excited because his guidance counselor, who's really nice, is Anishinaabekwe. And he knew that. And he was like cool with that. He thought that was great. She's really nice. And so I see this change starting to happen, and I see it in my own classrooms too. When I started at the University of Toronto a while ago teaching, students would come in and they would not know about residential schools. I would be teaching that. They would not know about treaty history. I'd be starting to teach them that. And they're coming in now informed and wanting to know more. Our Indigenous studies programs are growing as our diverse student body increasingly understands their importance. The change does seem slow year over year, but when I look back, I do see it actually seems quite rapid. And then, for example, I'm also increasingly asked to speak about Indigenous Crown treaty history as part of international history at the university. Colleagues who work in international history now say, well, that's international history. And I say, yes, it is. And they say, we should be talking about that. And international law, treaty law is international law. So I've been asked by the organizers to share some of what I've learned in my historical research work that addresses the theme of this year's gathering, restoring the balance, especially with respect to governance and Anishinaabe law. And I was thinking about what stories I could share as a Shaganashkwe about Anishinaabe events and practices of the past that could usefully speak to the theme of restoring the balance. So we talked about this at the beginning of the summer, and that got me thinking, so I spent the whole summer thinking. I don't know if I've come up with anything useful, but I hope I have. But as a historian, my work is in the archives. That means, effectively, I tell this at family gatherings, I read dead people's mail for a living. That is my job. That's what it is. It's mostly male, and they're usually quite dead. So there you go. That's it. And my work is in the rearview mirror as a historian. I'm always looking to the past, and this might explain the front bumper of my car, actually, now that I think about it some more. But I'm looking in the past. And so this call of the committee to ask me to think about restoring the balance was a call to turn around and look at the present and look at the future. And because restoring is an active verb, and that's a good thing because, as you know, Deb was reminding us about the importance of verbs in Anishinaabe. It's something done now. You're restoring. That's something you're doing now in the present, and with the idea of shaping a different future. And I think about Wanda Nanabush, who's an Anishinaabe curator at the Ontario Art Gallery, and she talks about how you pick up pieces of the past. When you pick up pieces of the past, you allow people to have a different future. So I just try to think of the historical work in that kind of way. So if we're restoring and it's in the present, the idea of shaping a different future, but then we also have the idea of balance. And balance is a relative term, right? Balance with respect to what? Right? Unless you're in stasis in some Star Trek universe. Are you balanced on something, with something? And it's something that usually requires work, like gravity, to fight against. And you either have to exert physical or mental effort to keep in balance. So I thought this was really useful as a historian to think about restoring balance, because I'm thinking about not just restoring a balance of the present for the future, but looking to the past to learn how people, how ancestors engaged in the work of maintaining balance or restoring balance when catastrophes hit, because as Deb pointed out, they hit and you have to recover from them. So how can study the past inform the work of the present to transform the future? So I'm going to share a few stories that I've gathered over the years around the themes of governing through alliance. Around 4 ideas I think are connected to this theme, and please, I look forward, as I always learn at these gatherings, what I don't know, which is many things. So I offer these, in other words, for your consideration. So the first is the importance of ceremony. I'm going to talk about some of the historic examples of ceremony in the archival record and what I think they offer. The role of women, centrally connected to restoring balance. The relationship between local and regional governance, what that should look like, because that, I think, is connected to balance. And the idea of tradition and change, or traditions as changing, as living, flexible, breathing concepts, not static and rigid and fixed. So I hope, I'm just going to give a few examples that I hope spark further discussion over lunch, which will come. And I say again, as a settler and as a historian, the stories I'm going to share on the events I talk about come from the written records of principally of Europeans visiting, and some from, actually, the mid-19th century and later, Anishinaabe writers themselves. And so written sources are far from perfect sources, and especially when they are authored by overwhelmingly men and overwhelmingly colonial officials. They saw and experienced the Anishinaabe world through their own lenses, and sometimes they made really, well, the wrong assumptions. As a historian, though, I've been trained to not take them at their word, to read, as we say, against the grain, to pay attention to these silences, who they're not talking about, what they're not saying, and to compare and corroborate their evidence, and to read these sources informed by the voices of Indigenous scholars, two brilliant examples of whom are sitting right here today, and whom all my students read their work, and of course present-day knowledge keepers, including those gathered here today, right? That's what also informs this work. And I also see there are some young people in this room, and I'm looking around at the young people. And if you are a young person and you actually think that reading dead people's mail sounds like a fun job, we need you. You are needed. And there's lots of, in terms of picking up the pieces of the past, and if you look at some of the wonderful historical community work that's being done at the back of the room here by Garden River in collaboration with Nipissing University, be inspired and think about joining us in the work of picking up the pieces of the past. So with that, I'll just briefly talk about the importance of ceremony, which is such an obvious thing to say in this room, I know. But the archival point I wanted to make is that every treaty council that I have examined that looks at councils between Anishinaabe people and representatives of imperial or colonial or British, Canadian governments open and close with ceremony. They're central. They are the bringing into the space Anishinaabe law. They form all the treaties. It's an integral part of this treaty law. It's everywhere. And in fact, it becomes formulaic. Like after 200 years, It's not formulaic from the Anishinaabeg perspective, but frustratingly, colonial officials write in their minutes, after the usual ceremonies, comma, and that's it. But sometimes visitors to those ceremonies who were seeing them for the first time tell us what those ceremonies were, right? And that they always started with pipe ceremonies and tobacco. Sema was a part of these ceremonies at the very beginning. And that they opened these councils. Champlain, the French cartographer and geographer who gets all the press, in his meeting of his very first Anishinaabe council was sort of stunned that people didn't talk for half an hour while the pipe went around. And he said the people explained to him the importance of being in a good frame of mind, that the work of the opening ceremonies set the stage for the deliberations that followed. And that was over 400 years ago. So this is continuity into the present. It's been ongoing. Okay. And though these observers didn't always realize the extent of what was happening in those ceremonies, including how the speakers were invoking all of creation, all the lands and the waters, that Manitou were being invited to witness the deliberations and the agreements, that the Totem beings were also there too, and as people brought the knowledge and the insights of their Totem beings into council, we often miss that. They also often miss this another central principle of Anishinaabe law, this idea that personhood has a much bigger, the idea of legal personhood is much, much bigger in Anishinaabe law. Right? In British common law and this Quebec law, a person is a human being, and quite frankly, until 1929, women weren't legally people, and by definition in Canadian law. So it was a very narrow concept of personhood. But Anishinaabe personhood encompasses all of its old life, which means that we all have these responsibilities towards all this life, which is, of course, integral to the treaty process. Now, the ceremonies themselves, however, there were changes and new elements added over time. This is what I mean by living traditions. When treaty councils were opened and closed during the British era, there were military bands played. That was often part of the ceremonial process. There was always a feast. Now, sometimes in the treaty payments, in the annuity payments, you can see that the Crown charged against the treaty payment, the one bullock. And then the council minutes conveniently note that a bullock was roasted for lunch. So, yes, not the spirit of feasting to which one normally would expect. Nevertheless, this was an integral part of these processes. And the fact that pipes were central to these treaty relationships and these ceremonies meant that when a treaty partner, particularly the Crown and then later the Canadian government, forgot their treaty responsibilities, chiefs would send pipes, communities would send pipes, sometimes with letters, to Ottawa, to the governors general, to remind them that you should get the pipe, you should remember your treaty obligations. And so, and Alan and I have both been involved in the Great Lakes Research Alliance and had the privilege of traveling to many of these museum collections where there are many pipes in those collections, some of which have come into that context, that they were given to treaty partners to remind them that they were allies and had a responsibility. The other theme I wanted to talk about, of course, is the importance of women. That restoring the balance also brings up the importance of women in Anishinaabe governance, an importance that settler law, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, aimed to disrupt by disenfranchising women in the Indian Act and imposed the elected council on First Nations and barred women from participating in governance. And of course, this was grounded in European ideas, patriarchy, and ultimately in Christianity, that aimed to relegate women to a subordinate status, keep them in the home, in other words. Canadian law, as you know, didn't recognize gender equality until 1982. Historically, did not, kept women, elevated women, I should say, and had them as an integral part of government. We can still see today that even though we've got gender equality in Canadian society writ large, there's still significant disproportionate representation, right, in leadership roles and in management roles, senior leadership, overwhelmingly still male. So in the historical record, there are examples in the archival record of women's councils being an integral part of Anishinaabe governance. It's harder to find women and it's harder to find children in archival sources, but they are there. There are 3 treaties that were signed with Southern Ontario, Anishinaabe, and the British Crown before 1815, and the preamble clearly states that the treaties were with the chiefs, the warriors, referring to a warriors' council, and the principal women as signatories to the treaties. There is on all Great Lakes treaties, Anishinaabe, with the exception of Robertson Huron, which is an interesting exception, but with all the other Southern Ontario treaties and Anishinaabe signed with their totem images, there's only one treaty I've been able to find that has clearly 3 women's totem images on it. It was a 1784 cession by the Mississauga, giving of land, permission to settle, to the British Crown that allowed for the 6 nations to settle on the Grand River. And it's interesting, there are 3 totem images. One's a crane, one's definitely a beaver, and the other one, it's a little hard, I think it's a crane. And it clearly, the clerk clearly wrote, her mark, her mark. 2 of them are, their last name, their names are Quay. The Quay ending is visible. And but that was, the cession was for land on both sides of the river, both sides of the Grand River. And water, this is my hypothesis, since water is an area of women's responsibilities and law, and the animals that live in the water, the shoreline, the rice harvest, all these areas of historic responsibility. And this was a cession that was going to involve lands on both sides of a major river. I have a feeling that that's why those women's marks were on that treaty, right? They were really had to be, they had to be engaged fully in that decision. So women's responsibilities historically included, as you know, the sugar bushes that Deb was speaking of. An entire family participated in the sugar harvest. Multiple examples of that women were the ones who directed the work. What responsibilities included fisheries management and wild rice harvesting, so these encompassing broad areas. And historically, women did marry outside of the communities of their birth, but into communities where they had existing family ties. And of course, this still happens today. But the connections, the way the Indian Act sets up the membership that you have to belong to one community or another community, but not both, cuts against the historic practices where women could speak in councils that both the communities where they were born and the communities and where they were raising their families. In other words, kind of like a dual citizenship model, if you think about it, with the kind of responsibilities to speak up in both places. So this then gets us to the idea about restoring the balance between local and regional governance. Again, after 150 years of concerted effort on the part of the Canadian government to isolate and not have strong Anishinaabe nations. But prior to that, governance was managed by clear and balanced between the clear jurisdictions of the local councils and broader alliances and broader councils. And at these regional gatherings, where alliances between attending council fires were reconfirmed, and lots of what we're doing, everyone's doing here today. It's clear local councils made decisions about who was a member of the community, who could live on the land, right? Who had access to which resources. And that regional gatherings were places where leadership of local councils were reaffirmed, where boundaries between local councils were adjusted, and new councils were created because Anishinaabe territory and lands did change over time. And there were new council fires created. And they are in the archival record. You can see this happen. we know it happened before, was happening long before Europeans showed up as well. So there's this whole body of law of when a new community needs to be created, how do other communities recognize it? So each of these councils are sites of governance, and each had their areas of responsibility. You can think of this as constitutional government. And I think what's also important is that constitutionally, these regional councils didn't have power over the local councils, right? So it's not like in a federal system where the federal level has some response, can sort of overpower provincial decisions, right? It had a much more balanced constitution. And local councils were broadly democratic in their decision-making, with the chief and council taking advice from the Council of Women and Council of Warriors. So that meant that the broad community participation in decision-making right at the local level. And, even in the I should say, communities were really clear about where decisions needed to be made. So we can point to certain specific examples. For example, in 1860, there was a large gathering at Sarnia, including leadership from the North Shore, who'd come down to Sarnia to create a long petition, which they intended to give to the Prince of Wales, because Queen Victoria's eldest son was on a big tour in 1860 of all of British North America. He was 18, he was big trouble. She was sending him on a tour to help him, manage himself a little better. Anyway, so he's sent on this tour, but Indigenous leaders saw this opportunity, because this is the same year that the imperial government is disavowing its responsibility for treaty relations, and it was handing that over to the province of Canada. To seize the moment to be invited to a council where the Prince of Wales was going to give out Queen Victoria medals and supposedly renew the alliance, to seize the moment to deliver a petition listing the many grievances that the nations had, including the Robinson-Huron Treaty Nations, had with the way the province of Canada was not upholding treaty relations, to complain about the regulation of the fishing with the Fisheries Act, which was against the treaty, to complain about the frauds and abuses in the land sale process, the lack of accountability in money, all this very straight, long rebuke of the Crown's behavior. And at that council that was planning the petition, an Mississauga Anishinaabe woman named Catherine Sutton, Nanebokwe, came about a land matter. She had been trying to get her title to land recognized in Owen Sound. She had married a non-native man, William Sutton, and as far as the Indian Department was concerned, even in 1860, that meant she was no longer First Nation. She shouldn't have that land. So she brought her complaint to this regional council, and the regional council listened at great length to what she was saying. But then the chiefs who then subsequently spoke pointed out that actually wasn't their jurisdiction, right? That they couldn't address that because it was a local matter, right? The land matter had to be between the local council fire and the Crown. And so, this is a really rich example of just how well worked out this was and how much people followed their law, even though at the time, the settler population at that point, there were over 1 million white settlers in southern Ontario and about 10,000 Anishinaabe. But they were still following their law and their principles about which body of government was responsible for what. So the regional governments or efforts at regional government did continue. Grand councils continued to meet right up until 1936. But they were greatly reduced after Confederation. And they were reduced because Indian Affairs would only fund a chief and one councillor to travel, and they would only release band funds for that amount. And of course, women were no longer going. Communities were no longer gathering, right? So it really had a negative impact. It was not until the 1970s that Ottawa agreed to provide some support for regional tribal councils as consolidated service providers. And again, this is a really understudied area of history. But this is far away, from the independence that was exercised by local and regional councils prior to the imposition of the Indian Act. So the last theme area I just want to touch on is the idea of tradition and change, and the idea of restoring the balance. Sometimes, and I counter this with my students a lot, they have this idea that traditions are fixed. You know, if you talk about traditional governance or traditional, we do things because it's traditional, that somehow that's static and it never changes. That it's something we did in the past and we have to keep doing it in the future. But that can become a problem because traditions need to keep living. And to thrive, they do need to change, but they need to change around core principles and values that are reinvented by every generation. You know, an example today is this actual treaty gathering. We can see traditional core principles of governance and law enacted transparently, but we're, zooming it with hybrid technology happening here, right? But this is cool because it's letting people who can't travel participate in the conversation and post questions on the chat. So it's getting back to that idea. It's just the technology's changing. There are all kinds of rich examples of this in the archival record, and I'll just share, one with you. In 1836, a woman named Anna Jameson, a white woman who was the wife of the Attorney General for the province, was traveling all around this region, and she came to Bawating and she was really excited. She wrote a book called Winter Rambles and Summer Studies, or maybe it's Summer Studies and Winter Rambles, I don't know, she was rambling about, but she came to Bawating and she was really excited because she wanted to see traditional Anishinaabe dwellings, and so she comes and near the house of her friend was a wigwam, and she was very excited to go in it and report on it, and there inside was beautifully appointed. She noted the beautiful mats and the woven mats and the wall pockets and the pouches that were all there to hold all the belongings, very comfortable living space, and a brand new coffee grinder. The manual coffee grinders, and that really set her back because that did not, but it's coffee, of course. People are going to have coffee. And you see this throughout, right, especially in the 19th and into the 20th century, where, of course, settlers will come along with what you want to call the tradition trap, right, and expect people to be traditional in certain ways. And, of course, people are busy being people and coffee. So he had the latest, actually, apparently. So you see these kinds of changes happening, of course, before. I mean, Europeans didn't bring change. Change happened long before Europeans, and the laws and the stories that Deb and Alan were speaking about hold that knowledge. I'm going to end actually with a story that actually involves this community, Nipissing, and it starts a long time ago, back before the first Shaganash ever showed up in this area. Around the 15th century, the Eastern Alliance of Anishinaabe, your ancestors in this territory, entered into an alliance with the Huron-Wendat, who at that time had villages sort of and communities kind of in the Whitchurch-Stouffville-Markham area, and invited them to come up and live in Midland in the Penetanguishene area. And then Eastern Robertson Huron Treaty Anishinaabeg ancestors and Nipissing, some of them went down south in the winter and overwintered near those communities and traded over the winter. Wendat had great corn, squash, and beans, and Anishinaabe were amazing fishers. And so they had this mutually beneficial alliance relationship that strengthened everyone. In 1837, after one winter from there's a record in the Jesuit Relations of Nipissing Nation people coming home after a horrible epidemic had swiped through the Wendat villages. So we can have extra sympathy for them at this time. 70 people died that winter. 70 people, and the 70 bodies, they canoed home to be buried here on these lands. It was probably influenza, it might have been measles. It was a bit early for smallpox, but it was just horrible. 5 years later, after this devastating loss, there was a huge regional gathering, treaty gathering, hosted by the Nipissing, and also to renew their alliance with the Wendat. And the Wendat were not kind of the expert canoers Anishinaabe were, so the council was held a little farther south, more Wasauksing area. Didn't have as far to travel. And so this gathering that was held, invited the farthest away nations came from Bawating, all the way down, and it was about 2,000 people, and it was in late August, and the two Jesuits who attended and they recorded just how happy people were to visit with their relatives. The cries and happiness echoed off the rocks, huge giveaways, ceremonies. There was a grand entry, of course, as everybody canoed in by nation. There was feasting, dancing, visiting, games, including a greasy pole climb where only one person was able to get to the top, and he kind of was a Wendat, and he used 2 knives to do it, and everyone accused him of cheating, so he had to kind of pay his prize back as a tax for using the knives to anchor himself up instead of just trying to climb the pole. So there you go. And there were canoe races. And it was here, through these massive gift exchanges, that the Allied Council Fires renewed their alliances and reconfirmed their responsibilities as allies to provide for one another. And I noticed the new clothes that your Grand Chief was wearing, clothed here from Nipissing, and that's very much the traditional practice of giving clothing and giving headdresses to affirm chiefly leadership. A funny one occurred actually with the French a few years later. The French, on receiving headdresses at the Treaty of Montreal, gave hats back, but they also, I guess, gave the wigs too, so it was just a little confusion. And I don't know whether it's because they got given a headdress and it had some really nice, marten or fur on the headdress, some of the headdresses, and they just put the curly hair on, and anyway. So you can just imagine that. That was quite the statement, fashion statement. Anyway, back to Nipissing here. This wonderfully hosted council fire lasted over 2 weeks, and the Jesuits could not get away the wealth that the Nipissing Nation had produced to give away to everyone who had come. And it was just, they called it a king's ransom. The baskets, the moccasins, the blankets, all these gifts that were given. Now, these gatherings continued and continued, but we only get snippets in the archival record when we actually get these kind of eyewitness accounts. In 1670, there was one held just north of, actually probably in the vicinity of Dreamer's Rock is where it sounds like, where it was held, for Mayingin and the Amiquois council fire. And at that one, the Jesuit didn't give as much rich a description, although he complained bitterly that no one could hear him preaching because everyone was too busy saying hi and screaming and being happy at seeing their relatives. He said, nobody could hear me over the din of all the promiscuous mingling, were his exact words. I imagine him just sort of stuck on a rock somewhere, and he's just like, nobody's listening to me. But if you think about it, the children who were at the 1642 gathering renewing the alliance were adults in 1670, and the adults in 1642 were the elders, and this work was carrying on to renew these alliance relationships. And after that gathering, where people, the Amiquois had given all their wealth, there was a massive distribution of wealth there, well then that winter, Allied council fires came and hunted together, and they hunted a huge number of moose together. So you see again where the local communities, although they were autonomous and responsible for their own lands, sustained each other, right, through this continual reciprocal exchange. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope everyone will get to lunch soon. So thank you very much for the kindness of listening. And I look forward to more treaty gatherings in the years to come.
Miigwech.